Chapter 16. Politics and Gunplay. In Violet's opinion, Sunday was an almost normal day. They packed a picnic lunch of sliced chicken sandwiches, pickles, and Cherry Cola, and rode in the Hope Chest out to a quiet field beside a river where there was nobody around to worry about what any of them looked like. They didn't wear any roses either. Violet and Myrtle rode in the wooden trunk bed of the back of the Hope Chest. It was a bumpy, dusty ride, but Violet didn't care because she was wearing her horrible plaid dress, and she was hoping to ruin it. She did, too. Chloe insisted that the first thing you had to learn about cars was how to take care of them, so she brought out a grease gun and an oil can and showed Myrtle and Violet how to lubricate the spindle bolt and the steering ball socket and the universal joint and about 100 other things Violet couldn't remember the names of. While the three of them climbed over and under the Hope Chest, getting gloriously dirty, Mr. Martin sat under a tree and read the Sunday paper. Then Chloe showed them how to start the thing. Violet doubted she'd ever be able to start a car by herself. It seemed to require two people, one to turn the crank at the front, which was tricky because if the car backfired, the crank could break your arm, said Chloe, and one to work the throttle and the spark, two levers on the steering wheel. And you had to really listen, said Chloe. Violet didn't know what Chloe was really listening for, because when the thing started, it sounded like a barrel of tin cans being eaten by a steam engine. To drive the car, you had to use your feet to work the reverse pedal and the high and low speed clutch, and your hand to work the throttle. It was too much to think of all at once, and Violet was glad that they had this whole big open field so that she didn't have to worry too much about steering. Instead, she concentrated on using the foot pedals and hand levers to keep the car running as it jolted and jumped over the hummocky field. When it was Myrtle's turn to drive, Violet went to sit with Mr. Martin and look at the newspaper. Mr. Martin had prudently moved a little farther into the trees, out of the way of the Hope Chest. Is the whole Sunday paper about nothing but baseball? Violet asked, flipping through the pages. Pretty much. Isn't it grand? Why is there nothing in here about what's going on with the amendment? Violet asked. They're probably trying to pretend it isn't happening, said Mr. Martin. Good heavens, I can't believe the Yankees lost to the Tigers. They should never have taken on Babe Ruth. Violet noticed a story at the top of the page. They caught him. Mr. Martin started. Caught who? He said wearily. Veteran hobo at 12 is in hands of police, Violet read out loud. Hobie, the fellow who helped us get to Washington. Poor lad, said Mr. Martin, but he'll be off on his travels again soon, I'm sure. Violet read the article. The reporter seemed very amused by the whole story and recounted that Hobie claimed he'd be off again in no time. Looks like the White Sox are getting stomped, Mr. Martin observed. They deserve it after last year. Violet looked up at Myrtle and Chloe, bumping over the field in the Hope Chest. Myrtle, who was shorter than Violet, seemed to be having a considerable difficulty seeing over the hood while working both the hand and foot controls. And then at Mr. Martin, reading the baseball scores. They all had something hanging over them, Violet thought. Myrtle had nowhere to go, except back to the Girls' Training Institute. Poor Mr. Martin seemed to have nowhere to go but jail. And what about Chloe? Violet wasn't sure if Chloe saw anything after the Tennessee vote at all. Later, she and Myrtle took off their shoes and stockings and waded in a creek at the bottom of the field. The water was pleasantly cool on their feet, and the little minnows came up and nibbled on their legs as they stood in the current. Violet told Myrtle about Hobie being caught and sent him home to his stepmother. He'll take off again, said Myrtle. Probably already has. Do you ever think about what we're going to do with the rest of your life, Myrtle? Said Violet. Yes, said Myrtle. Well, what? Said Violet. I don't know, but it's going to be important, said Myrtle. They walked further downstream and tried to catch some frogs. When Violet finally did catch one, she held it for a moment enjoying the cool feel of its soft, clammy skin in her hands, and then it pushed off with its mighty hind legs and plopped into the water. Violet asked Myrtle if it wasn't time they headed back, and Myrtle said it wasn't. So they walked even further downstream and talked about the things they'd seen and done and heard in Nashville. Violet wanted to know more about where Myrtle and Mr. Martin were staying, but Myrtle was curiously reluctant to talk about it. "It's called Dead Horse Alley," said Myrtle. "We're staying with a lady in her house." "Is it like the alleys in Washington?" said Violet, remembering the tumble-down shacks and heaps of trash and rats. "Sort of different," said Myrtle with a shrug. "Look, there's some kind of animal hole over there." So they went over to the bank and looked at a burrow under the roots of a willow tree and tried to decide what might live there. Myrtle was fun to explore with, Violet thought. A lot more fun than the antis. But the world seemed to have been set up so that Myrtle and Violet would always be on different sides of an invisible line. By Monday, August 16th, nobody could tell which side anybody was on anymore. Nobody knew when the House was going to vote. The antis and the suffs were both polling the legislatures every few hours, and it seemed like every few hours the list of who was an anti and who was a suff had changed. Chloe and Violet, at their noon meeting, that she didn't think the polls were good at all anymore. They had met at the lunchroom in Union Station because Violet was supposed to have been spending the morning watching the train station telegraph offices for the antis. She hadn't really been doing this, of course, but she had gone to the train station for verisimilitude. Chloe had been assigned to spend some more time with Harry T. Byrne, but he had gone up to the Capitol. The SUF strategy required that only Tennessee women lobby legislators at the Capitol. Northerners were known to irritate Southerners, and the SUFs didn't want the Tennessee legislators to be irritated. "I don't think we have a chance with Byrne anyway," said Chloe. He's just enjoying the attention. He's so young." Violet had heard that Byrne was 24, which was a year older than Chloe. He's still wearing a red rose. "Let's go up to the Capitol," said Chloe, when they finished their chicken salad sandwiches. "But we're not supposed to," said Violet. "Oh, we won't lobby anybody," said Chloe. "I just want to see what's going on. Besides, you've never seen it, have you? It's nice." Chloe drove the Hope Chest carefully along Broadway and then up 6th Avenue, braking to let people pass. The city seemed to be getting more crowded every minute. Not everyone had yellow or red symbols to show that they were suffs or antis. There were a lot of tourists who had just come to watch the battle. Chloe stopped to let a woman pushing a high-back wicker wheelchair cross the street. In the wheelchair was a young man whose legs ended at the knee, who Violet guessed from his age might have been a soldier. The woman looked like she might be his mother. "I wish you hadn't left Stephen alone like that," Chloe said. "You wish I hadn't?" Violet was stung by the unfairness of this. "I didn't leave him alone. I left him with Mother and Father." "Yes, but being with Mother and Father can be a bit like being alone. You know." "Yes, I do know, as a matter of fact," Violet said, folding her arms. "Violet, you don't think I abandoned you, do you? Father threw me out." "No, he didn't," Violet argued. "He told you never to darken his door again when you bought the Hope Chest, but you'd already moved out by then." "Yes." Chloe stopped again. A yellow dog was wandering across the road ahead of them. "I had to leave, Violet." "So did I," said Violet. "Anyway, it's not like Stephen really notices who's around him." "I think he does," said Chloe. Then Violet remembered that Chloe had studied to be a nurse since leaving home. "Do people with shell shock ever get better?" "Some do," said Chloe. "It takes time, and it may be that they all do. It's a fairly new disease. We don't know much about it. Damn!" The engine gave a loud pow and stopped running. Now we're stalled. "Violet, could you crank?" Violet got out, went to the front of the car, and inserted the metal crank, that turned the starter. She cranked until the car coughed, spat smoke, and started. Then she got back in the passenger seat next to Chloe. They chugged on. "So what causes it then?" Violet said. "Well, some doctors believe it's caused by low air pressure in areas where a lot of shells have been fired." "Not by—" Violet searched for a word. "Cowardice?" said Chloe bluntly. "No. Why should it be? After all, shell shock is a new disease, and cowardice is as old as humanity." Violet thought about this. Made sense. That was one of the nice things about Chloe. She was always so sensible. When Chloe ruined it by saying, "Violet, even if Stephen was frightened, why shouldn't he be, surrounded by bombs and bullets and enemy soldiers?" Violet made no reply. She liked the low air pressure explanation better. The street in front of the Capitol was full of Model Ts, parked diagonally on both sides. Chloe slid the hope chest into an empty space and they got out. Violet remembered her red rose and pulled it off, sticking it inside her hat in case she needed it later. "Doesn't it matter, us going into the Capitol together, when I'm pretending to be an anti?" she asked. "I don't think anyone's paying any attention at this point," said Chloe with a tired smile. "Both sides are panicking, just trying to figure out which side the legislatures are on, and then the vote is going to happen. There are some Tennessee suffs up there guarding the special House committee that's supposed to meet on the amendment tonight." Chloe nodded up at the Capitol. "What's the committee meeting supposed to do?" Violet asked as they climbed up the 72 stone steps toward the Capitol. Violet had heard that a Model T Ford had climbed these steps a few years ago to prove the superiority of automobiles to horse-drawn carriages. Violet wondered if Chloe would be willing to try driving the hope chest up these steps. She looked at Chloe's exhausted face and decided now was not the time to suggest it. "A committee's job is to look at a bill and decide whether or not to send it to the floor to be voted on by the legislature," Chloe said, sounding weary. "In this case, it's a bill saying that Tennessee ratifies the Susan B. Anthony Amendment." She stopped to rest, leaning against the pedestal of a statue. "A week ago, we had a clear majority. Nearly 2/3 of the House members said they favored the bill. But thanks to the antis and their businessmen and mystery men, it now looks like the committee might not even vote to send the bill to the floor." "And if it does get sent to the floor," said Violet, moving around to see if there was any shade anywhere, "then it needs a 3/4 vote to pass?" "3/4? No, only a majority. More than half of the House, that's all it needs." "In school we learned—" Violet frowned, trying to remember. It hadn't seemed nearly as important when they learned it in school as it did now. "A constitutional amendment requires a 2/3 vote of Congress and a 3/4 of the state legislatures. That means the legislature of 3/4 of the state," said Chloe. "In other words, 36 of the 48 states. And we've got 35.5 now. But we don't need the Tennessee House itself to vote 3/4 in favor. All we need is a simple majority. And we're so close." She looked up at the old cannons that surrounded the Capitol, left over from the Civil War. "Capitols are built on hills, so they can be protected if the people revolt," said Chloe, looking up at the cannons and smiling. Violet guessed from the smile that Chloe had probably heard this from Mr. Martin. "Why are the women antis even bothering?" Violet asked. This has been on her mind for the last several days. If they're that much against voting, why don't they just not vote when they get the right? "Some people are never satisfied unless they're making choices for other people," said Chloe. "And of course, a lot of the antis are funded by big business and by the political machines. Politics in this country is very corrupt, you know, Violet. Most elections are bought and sold. People sell their votes, and political machines in each city and state organize the purchase of votes." Violet nodded. too out of breath from the heat and climbing to bother replying. The corrupt bosses don't want women to mess things up, Chloe went on. They've spent over a century building up the vote buying system they've got now, and everything is so fine-tuned. If 27 million voters are suddenly added to the rolls for the November election, it'll destroy all their calculations. Violet moved around the statue again, still trying to find a spot of shade. Who is this fella? Chloe squinted up at the statue. Edward Ward Carmack. He was a newspaper editor who was gunned down in the streets of Nashville a few years ago. His murders were pardoned by the governor. Not the governor they have now. Pardoned by the governor? Violet tried to look up at the statue silhouette against the blazing white sun, but couldn't. They shot him down in the street in cold blood, and they were pardoned by the governor? Well, I don't know if it was cold blood, said Chloe, patting the pedestal. Mr. Carmack might have drawn first. But in his newspaper, he'd criticized the men who shot him, and he's also criticized Governor Patterson. He was against the liquor interests, Mr. Carmack was, and Mr. Patterson was for them. Governor Patterson pardoned the killers before they'd spent a day in jail. So the governor of a state can just have people he doesn't like killed? Violet said. Nothing she had learned about government in school had suggested this. Oh, I doubt it was quite like that, Chloe said. Come on. As they climbed on, Violet looked back at the statue, suddenly struck with the idea that messing around in politics could be a deadly business. The liquor interests hadn't liked Mr. Carmack, and they didn't like suffragists either. In spite of the midday heat, Violet shivered. Inside the Capitol, the low, vaulted stone ceilings gave you the feeling you were underground. It was dark and felt cooler than outside. They climbed a wide stone staircase. Violet ran her hand over the cool stone handrail. There was a huge, jagged gouge out in it. When Violet touched it, she had found that it too was smooth, as if hands had worn it down for many years. Chloe noticed Violet looking at it. That's from a bullet, she said. When the Tennessee legislature met after the Civil War, some of the legislators tried to escape because they didn't want to vote for Tennessee to rejoin the Union, but there were soldiers guarding them, and they opened fire. Violet stared at the gouge in the stair rail. No wonder Father thinks politics isn't safe for women. Chloe laughed. Well, I like to think once we're in it, there'll be a little less gunplay involved. Anyway, you can see why the Tennessee legislature might still be a little persnickety about having Yankees in here telling them what to do. Yes, said Violet. She followed Chloe up the stairs. The second story was lighter, with a high stone ceiling. The hallway was shaped like a cross. At one end was the House of Representatives. At the other were the Senate and the library. It all seemed oddly quiet after all the fuss and noise in the Hermitage and in the streets and in the train station during the week. Thank goodness you're here, Miss Mayhew. Miss Pulitzer burst through a doorway. We need to work on 2 of the SUF committee members. Quick, we've lost them. I thought only Southern women were allowed to lobby with legislators here in the Capitol, Chloe said. We're not in the Capitol. I mean, we've lost them, said Miss Pulitzer. Blotz and Credwell. They've flown the coop. Do you know what they look like? I think so. Then go. Please look for them. We've got search parties out. Mrs. Ann Dallas Dudley has gone to the Hermitage, and Miss Sue Shelton White is searching the moving picture shows and Sawalski's ice cream parlor. We have guards covering the train station, and I'm going to check the Intertubin train station on Broadway. But Credwell might have an automobile. We need someone to drive out the highway looking for them. Is the Hope Chest nearby? Myrtle and Mr. Martin were trying a variation on their diet of sardines, Uneeda biscuits, and peaches. Myrtle had gotten a can of tuna fish instead. Myrtle was setting the Uneeda biscuits neatly out on a napkin on Mrs. Reddy's oilcloth tabletop. and Mr. Martin was just slicing through the lid of the tuna can with his pocket knife when the door burst open. It hit the wall with a loud crack, and a board fell off it and clattered to the floor. Two men pounced into the room. They both had guns out, pointed at Mr. Martin. Myrtle dove into a corner. "Don't move, Arpadfi!" one of the men barked. Mr. Martin raised his hands over his head. "I'm not Arpadfi." "Of course you are. Who else would be able to pronounce it? Drop the knife. And that device you're holding in your game hand." Mr. Martin dropped the knife and the tuna fish on the floor. The knife stuck in the wooden floor. The can rolled lopsidedly, the smell of tuna fish rising from the oil dribbling out. The men peered at the can intently. "Not a bomb, just a can of tuna fish," one of them announced. "Cover him, Hank. I'm going to put the cuffs on him." The man who had spoke moved over behind Mr. Martin, grabbed his hands, and jerked them down behind Mr. Martin's back. Myrtle winced in sympathy. It was what that evil brakeman had done to her on that freight train. "Don't try nothing funny," said Hank. "Nobody cares if we shoot dangerous alien radicals." "I'm not an alien," said Mr. Martin. "I'm a U.S. citizen." "Uh-huh. And just when did you become a U.S. citizen, Arpadfi?" "My name is Theodore Martin, and I was born in the United States." "Let's drop the Martin Bushua, okay? You're Sandor Arpadfi, and you were born in some European hellhole or other." "Hungary," the other agent put in. "Hungary, then, around 1892, and you came to the United States in 1897. You lost 3 fingers in an industrial accident in 1898, and your left eye in a knife fight in 1916. The man who was holding Mr. Martin's arms, he had handcuffs hanging at his belt, Myrtle noticed, but he made no move to get them. Traced the scar from Mr. Martin's eye downward with his finger. It must be a glass eye, Myrtle realized. Mr. Martin jerked his head away. "Resisting arrest," the agent commented, twisting Mr. Martin's arms more tightly behind his back. "It wasn't a knife fight," Mr. Martin through clenched teeth. "The other man had a knife. I did not. And I am a U.S. citizen." "Right. You became a citizen in 1913, said the agent. "In other words, after you'd already become a radical. A radical can't become a U.S. citizen. I think the courts will find that your citizenship oath is null and void." "That's insane," Mr. Martin protested. Drops of sweat stood out on his forehead. Having his arms twisted must have hurt a lot, but he was trying not to show it. That was being brave, Myrtle supposed, but she wished he would cry out in pain so that his captors would be satisfied and stop hurting him. "In your position, I wouldn't be calling the laws of the United States of America insane," the agent suggested. "I don't believe that is the law," Mr. Martin panted. "And if it is the law, then it is insane." "Did you hear that, Hank?" the agent said. "Sure did, Christopher," said Hank. "Anything else you want to tell us about the law of the United States, Arpadfi?" Mr. Martin glared at both of them, and would have liked to say a lot of things, Myrtle could tell. "Only that I'm as much a citizen of the United States, USA, as you are, and I know my rights." "You're a member of a radical organization, and you don't have any rights," said Hank smugly. "I'm a member of a labor union," said Mr. Martin. "It's my—" He gasped in pain, and Myrtle winced again. "First Amendment right. The International Workers of the World is a labor union the way the Boston Tea Party was a tea party," Christopher said. "Quit arguing with us, or we might notice you pull a knife on us. You see how he had that knife out when we came in, Hank?" He kicked at the open pocket knife where it had fallen on the floor. Myrtle would have liked to grab it and put it away, but then they'd probably say she pulled it on them. "Sure did," said Hank. "You gonna come along quietly, Arpadfi, or should we report you pulled a knife on us?" Mr. Martin looked deflated. The same way he had on the train when he argued with the conductor, Myrtle thought. What choice do I have? I'm coming along quietly. He looked at Myrtle as if he was about to say something. Myrtle shook her head and put a finger to her lips to silence him. It was better for both of them if Myrtle remained invisible. In spite of the fact that Mr. Martin was coming along quietly, the agent seemed to find it necessary to do quite a bit of kicking and shoving to get him out the door. Myrtle turned away. She picked up the knife Mr. Martin, or Podfee, or whatever his name was, had dropped, folded it, and stuck it in the pocket of her blue dress, next to her picture of her mama and daddy. She went to the cot where she slept and grabbed her toothbrush. She was just headed out the door when she bumped into Mrs. Reddy coming in. "Got 'em, did they?" said Mrs. Reddy. "Thank the good Lord. Child, now that you're free of that horrible man, I'm taking you to Mrs. Frankie Pierce. She's a colored suffragist leader who's done wonders in finding institutions that will take in wayward colored girls, and I'm sure she'll find—" Miss Reddy was packing up Myrtle's bundle as she said all this, and Myrtle didn't wait around to hear the rest of it. So she didn't know if Mrs. Reddy had turned in Mr. Martin? Lots of people could have done it. He's been so careless about staying hidden, and she wasn't about to ask her. If Miss Reddy had done it, then she'd have to hate Miss Reddy, and she really didn't have time for that. She ran out the door.